From the University of Nebraska at Omaha, this is NCITE Insights. I'm your host, Erin Grace. Join us as we discuss today's most pressing issues in terrorism and targeted violence with experts from the field. Well, NCITE listeners, you're in for a treat. This is a special audio version of this podcast today because it is the week before finals, or the week of finals, I guess I should say. And the UNO students are busy cramming and getting everything turned in. With me today is Elle Ward. She is just brilliant and awesome. We're so glad she's here at UNO. Elle is a graduate student pursuing a master's in applied computing and informatics. Elle, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And you told me, but tell our audience, when do you graduate with your master's?
I will actually be walking this Friday for my GIS master's, but my applied computing and informatics program will conclude in next December, 2025.
Thank you. I forgot you were getting one master's on Friday and the next master's a year from now. Good for you. I hope you get 2 graduation parties and a bunch of loot for all that hard work. And you're also here at NCITE working with Dr. Matt Allen and his team, evaluating the Department of Homeland Security's Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program. And I can tell you that deliverable is just being finished up in comms. I think Blake is putting the finishing touch on it, and that should be available online. So congratulations on getting that done. How long have you been here at NCITE?
I've been at NCITE for about a year and a half now.
Oh, wow. And what kinds of things have you learned, or how has the experience shaped you?
Massively, for sure. Particularly with this project, my boss, Dr. Matt Allen, he's my faculty mentor on a GRACA award I received to fund it, which would not have been possible without me working here at NCITE. I've received funding from the center to present this terror trafficking nexus research at conferences in Scotland. It's been amazing, and then just also having access to all the amazing people here and all their crazy expert knowledge has been completely invaluable to this project.
And for our listeners, Elle, they may not know what a GRACA is. Can you explain what that is?
Yes, the GRACA award, it stands for the Graduate Research and Creative Activity Award. It's through the Office of Research and Creative Activity here at UNO, and I received an award of $2,300 to fund my terror trafficking nexus research.
Okay, so you, so in addition to helping one of our NCITE researchers on his contract work for DHS, you separately have gotten your own grant to fund your interest in the nexus between human trafficking and terrorism.
Yes.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
Your first grant? Is that your first grant?
Yeah.
Okay, well that's great. Good for you. I want to talk all about that. Listeners will want to hear it, but before we get there, I hope you will indulge and describe your facility with language. Tell us what you speak and understand and write.
I'm at a conversational level. I'm most familiar with Irish, French, German, and Spanish, but I've been very grateful to have various experiences for travel, for immersion programs. In high school, I got to go to China on a language immersion award from the Chinese Ministry of Education. I've gotten to National Security Language Initiative for Youth Awards in Russian and Tajiki Persian, and then most recently, last summer, I was in the Ulster Gaeltacht studying Irish through the Fulbright Gaeltacht Award, which is in conjunction with Ireland's Department of Tourism, Arts and Culture, I believe.
Do you think you'll want to live in another country someday and work?
I really like to travel and visit new places, but at the end of the day, I love being in Nebraska. So I like to stay in Nebraska, but travel as much as I can.
Well, the Department of Tourism ought to just put that in a commercial right now, because given how much you can speak these other languages and how well you've traveled, that you want to stay here is great. Nebraska's lucky. So let's get to it, Elle. you're interested in this dark and kind of obscure subject, human trafficking, and how it overlaps with terrorism. How did you come to this subject of all things?
Yeah, so I actually started in the anti-child marriage space, which introduced me to how that overlapped with human trafficking in various ways. And then I went to work in the human trafficking practitioner space, sort of developing screening tools. And in that experience, I saw how useful GIS, geographic information systems, was in targeting and combating human trafficking, which brought me back to UNO for a GIS master's. And that's when I joined NCITE as a graduate research assistant. And terrorism and trafficking have become sort of my two main academic research interests, and the Trafficking-Terrorism Nexus was just sort of a convergence of the two of them.
That makes sense to me. I can kind of understand that. Can you give our listeners kind of an example of what is that nexus like with any group?
Yeah, one example of that could be in the mid-2010s during the battle for Mosul in Iraq. ISIS used forced laborers to build a system of labyrinthine tunnels beneath the city, which significantly extended the siege and resulted in lots of casualties. So that is one example of the labor trafficking terrorism nexus.
This is a very meaty subject, and I'm wondering if you can help break it down for us with some main points. What are some chief takeaways we should have about this project?
Yeah, I specifically studied labor trafficking, the labor trafficking terrorism nexus, and the first takeaway would most likely be that some terrorist organizations exploit trafficked individuals for various forms of forced labor, logistical support, or even recruitment, which in turn strengthens their operational capacities while reducing their costs. Mm-hmm. Another would be that Another would probably be that similar conditions that foster terrorism, such as poverty, instability, or weak governance, also create the vulnerabilities and lack of oversight that human traffickers exploit, which makes trafficking both a consequence and a facilitator of terrorist activity. The third would be, so in my thesis, we used the hotspot approach to human trafficking, where basically we're trying to identify specific countries and years where there's high levels of both labor trafficking and terrorist activity. And in this, we found two different kinds of hotspots emerged. The first being multi-year, so a country might be a hotspot from 2017 to 2020 or 2003 to 2007. It'll just be an expanse of consecutive years. And these hotspots usually indicate sustained socioeconomic and political vulnerabilities and necessitate long-term intervention strategies. The other kind of hotspot that we found is a single-year hotspot. So this would be maybe one country only being a hotspot for 2007 or 2013. Some countries are single-year hotspots in multiple years, like 2009 and 2019 was one of them. But these hotspots, the single-year hotspots, suggest responses to situational crises or spikes in activities that might benefit from more immediate targeted efforts. Next, in the hotspot analysis, the areas that we found to be most impacted by the labor trafficking terrorism nexus were North Africa, the Middle East, and the Lower Balkans. And this coincides with major migratory routes that are associated with human trafficking, such as the Balkan route or the Central Mediterranean route, but also with regions that have terrorist organizations who have been known to traffic for forced labor, such as Boko Haram, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and others. And then finally, some of the socioeconomic factors we identified that impact the labor trafficking terrorism nexus through a negative binomial regression analysis were first the unemployment rate, which had a marginally significant impact, and then also the global terrorism index, which had a highly significant impact.
Why are the unemployment rate and the global terrorism index, why were those so impactful?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we're still trying to identify the main root causes of, but from just a basic level, the unemployment rate having a marginally significant impact definitely sort of hints at the role that economic conditions play in and increasing human trafficking activity in an area. And then as far as the Global Terrorism Index goes, that's a composite metric that essentially measures the impact that terrorist activity has in a region. So there may be areas where there's high terrorist activity, but it doesn't necessarily cause a lot of actual damage. The attacks maybe aren't that successful, or they're just smaller. So the Global Terrorism Index measures what areas have the largest amount of property damage or casualties or deaths caused. And so finding that the Global Terrorism Index had a highly significant impact on labor trafficking counts kind of points towards the organizational capacity that a terrorist organization would need to have to carry out effective human trafficking operations.
Wow, that is a great answer. Thank you for explaining that. Is there anything else about your work in this space that you want to talk about?
Yeah, one thing that sort of came up during this research was sort of the barrier to entry in studying human trafficking in general, but especially the terror trafficking nexus. A lot of human trafficking research is done on limited and restricted data sets, which in turn makes replication and validation of research, or even just answering new questions, quite difficult. So I think that focusing on bolstering pre-existing and continuing to create more open data initiatives and repositories will be have a significant impact on the quality and just plain amount of research done on the Nexus.
I have a chicken and the egg question.
Yeah.
So you know how that goes, which comes first. In terms of terrorism or human trafficking, is it the terrorism that comes first and then human trafficking is a byproduct of that?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that definitely depends on what region of the world you're looking at, because just the environments for terrorism vary so widely across the world, so do those for trafficking. However, you will see probably a bit of both. Some where the terrorism sort of starts up first and then it's therefore kind of bolstered. Somewhere the terrorism starts up first and then it kind of bolsters trafficking activity in the area, or some where maybe that instability was already sort of there and trafficking was sort of prevalent, and but then terrorism starts to arise afterwards, and eventually a nexus relationship could develop, or it could not. But yeah, that's a hard question, and definitely one where the answer is kind of it depends.
That's a fair answer. Here's another question. Maybe it's a dumb question. When I think about human trafficking and poverty, and I think about places in the world that are full of strife and hardship, I understand how human trafficking arises out of that. I also understand when people are trying to flee a bad place, they are vulnerable to all kinds of terrible things, human trafficking being one of them. So if there is a Venn diagram and human trafficking and poverty are together, does the poverty of a country or the hardship or the turmoil of a country beget terrorism? Or can terrorism happen in a stable country?
Yeah, I mean, terrorism certainly can happen in a stable country. It can and it does happen pretty much everywhere. Though you will tend to see sort of a difference in the attacks or the organizations or the individuals carrying it out. Like I know in the West, I think it's about like 98% of, or maybe that's the United States, 98% of terrorist attacks are lone wolf attacks, which obviously a lone wolf terrorist is going to be far less likely to utilize human trafficking as compared to a fully operational and organized terrorist group that is operating and controlling a region, such as ISIS or Boko Haram, similar organizations have done. So yeah, terrorism can and definitely does happen in countries that would be considered stable, but the terror trafficking nexus will probably look quite different depending on that stability of the country it's taking place in.
Wow, that rings very true, obviously, given what we know about these places. I wonder, you didn't research this per se, but given your interest, had you seen anything to indicate a solution? Now, I'm not talking about a pat little tidy, here you go, Erin, we've solved it. But what are ways to disrupt this nexus?
Yeah, that's a great question. And ultimately, sort of the main takeaway that we came to in the research as far as a possible solution goes, at this point, it's mainly going to be being sure to target sort of those underlying structural vulnerabilities, such as extreme poverty or weak governance in these areas that already are sort of undergoing counter-terrorist efforts, because these factors, if left untreated, will re-enable human trafficking in the future and can and do also re-enable terrorism in a region if it has been subdued. So yeah, it's not an easy or quick fix by any means, but it's definitely going to be targeting instability at all levels.
Yeah. I want to read you something that I saw today in the New York Times, and this is a story about the country of Myanmar and how professional women, doctors, nurses, etc., have had to turn to prostitution given the conditions in the country. Inflation has soared to 26%. The currency has lost a lot of its value. Half of the people now live in poverty, according to the World Bank. And I think what was so shocking about this story is when you think of who you think will be sex trafficked, you're not necessarily thinking of someone who is professionally trained. And so this is a nurse who's getting ready for one of her prostitution appointments. Here's the paragraph I want to read you. She put on a pink dress, and that night she earned $80, the equivalent of what she made in a month previously. And so what does that tell you, what you know about human trafficking, just that idea that this nurse could make more one night out as a prostitute than she could in an entire month?
Yeah, this sort of leads into some more contentious debates in specifically sex trafficking, and sort of falls in the realm of issues with sex work. Mm-hmm. So, of course, sex work is widely debated of whether it is work or whether it's more exploitation. And this specific form of sex work would fall more into what's called survival sex work, mm-hmm. which is less so just choosing it as a career path or a form of employment, and sort of more so turning to sex work because it's the only way you're going to be able to provide for your family, which is kind of a really gray area, both in people who consider sex work to be work and those who consider it to just be exploitation, as these people would not be doing it if they could make their means in another way. But as far as human trafficking goes, sex workers who are classified as survival sex workers are definitely at a much greater risk of becoming human or sex trafficking victims mm-hmm. than those who are not classed that way. So it certainly is something to be concerned about and raises pretty substantial red flags as far as human trafficking concerns go.
So what you're saying is somebody who's doing survival sex work is more at risk of being trafficked than somebody who has more agency.
Yes,
The key is
certain.
Agency.
Yeah.
I want to do this, not I have to do this, right?
Of course, yeah. Human trafficking is all about coercion, like force, fraud, coercion. They're the main elements of human trafficking. So anywhere that there's trafficking, there's not really much agency.
Right. And so in that regard, it made me think this article it deals with also prostitutes who go to jail, and now they have to, and so people who are trafficked, you mentioned earlier, maybe human traffickers are using these trafficked people to commit crimes. They're using them to commit terrorist attacks. So if you have no agency and you're being forced to do this, yet you have done something, is there any kind of legal defense that I didn't want to do this, I was trafficked into doing this? Have you seen that?
Yeah, definitely. So there's kind of a couple different sides to this. One way that human traffickers keep sex trafficking victims sort of under their
control.
Under their control. One way of doing that is sort of by building them a criminal rap sheet, so it is difficult for them to get work elsewhere. This is actually something that we've developed legislation against this in Nebraska, but in many states, prostitution is a crime. It's a crime to sell sex. And so if you were caught doing that, even if you were trafficked, it used to be a lot easier to still just get in legal trouble for prostitution. Now in Nebraska, I believe if it's proven that you were trafficked, your criminal record will get expunged. But that kind of feeds into the Nordic model of sex trafficking, which is used mainly in Nordic countries, but that's where it's legal to sell sex, but it's illegal to buy sex. So people who are trafficked don't really fear going to the police because they won't be getting in trouble. It would really just be Johns, or people that are buying it. Johns and Janes is sort of how they're referred to. People who buy sex, that would be the ones getting in trouble. As far as more serious crimes, such as people who are trafficked by terrorist organizations, Boko Haram kidnapped 276 schoolgirls in Chibok, Nigeria, and these girls ended up being exploited as sexual slaves, forced laborers. Some of them got exploited as suicide bombers. So if you are ultimately forced to carry out an attack, that the way of dealing with that will probably be quite difficult. And I'm not sure of what the law looks like all over the world in that regard, but I would hope that people who are being forced to do this against their will would get some leniency as far as any punishment would go.
It is so complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it sounds really difficult to get out of. I'm so grateful that you are raising our attention to this important issue. Often when we talk about terrorism, the subject we talk about are the actors, the terrorists themselves. I don't know that we hear enough about the victims, and certainly that would include people who were forced into acts of terror against their will, etc. So thank you for that, Elle. Any final thoughts? Anything I missed that you might want to talk about?
No, I think that about covers it.
Well, I'm really excited to see what you're going to do in your future. Congratulations on getting to walk on Friday, and I'm so happy that you get to stay here another year and get another master's degree, and I get to learn more from you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm very excited to keep being at NCITE. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Great. Thank you.
This series is produced by Ben Badafarano, Erin Grace, Scott Jordan, and Blake Ersch. Thank you for joining us for another episode of NCITE Insights. The National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, or NCITE, is an academic center of excellence for the Department of Homeland Security. Looking to find out more? Check out our website at ncite.unomaha.edu or email us at ncite@unomaha.edu.